The smell of burnt coffee and dry erase markers filled the conference room on the 18th floor of the Datasphere building in Austin, Texas. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the October sun cast long shadows across the Colorado River below. David Brennan sat at the head of the glass table, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his Herman Miller chair, a nervous habit he'd developed over his 12 years as Chief Technology Officer. Across from him, 23 engineers and product managers sat in various states of alertness, some nursing their third espresso of the morning, others frantically typing notes on their laptops. "The architecture can't handle it," Maya Rodriguez said, her voice cutting through the low hum of side conversations. She was 26, barely 3 years out of Stanford, sitting near the far end of the table where the junior engineers typically clustered. Her laptop screen glowed with what looked like terminal windows full of system logs. "I've been monitoring the database replication lag for the past 2 weeks. During peak hours, we're already hitting 72% capacity on the primary cluster. When we migrate the European customers to the same infrastructure next month, we're looking at failure points across—" "Maya," David interrupted, not looking up from his phone, where he was scanning an email from the VP of Sales. "We've been over this. The migration timeline is locked. We have contracts signed with enterprise clients in London, Berlin, and Amsterdam. They're expecting service to go live November 1st. That's 18 days from now." "I understand the business pressure," Maya continued, leaning forward slightly. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and there were shadows under her eyes that suggested she'd been losing sleep over this. "But I'm telling you, mathematically telling you, that the current configuration will collapse. I've run the simulations. The load balancer configuration we're using can't distribute traffic efficiently when we cross 80% capacity. We need to implement horizontal sharding across at least 3 additional clusters, and we need to do it before we bring the European customers online." Tom Walters, the Director of Infrastructure, let out an audible sigh. He was 42, broad-shouldered, with graying hair at his temples, and a reputation for meeting impossible deadlines. "With all due respect, Maya, this isn't a Stanford computer science lab. This is production infrastructure serving 4 million daily active users. We can't just restructure our entire database architecture 2 weeks before a major launch because a junior engineer ran some simulations." Several people around the table nodded. David saw Maya's jaw tighten, saw her fingers pause above her keyboard. "These aren't theoretical simulations," she said quietly. "They're based on our actual traffic patterns, our actual hardware specifications, our actual database schemas. I'm not making this up. I can show you the data." "Maya," David said, his voice taking on the tone he used when he needed to shut down a discussion and move forward. "I appreciate your diligence. I really do. But Tom's right. We have a proven infrastructure that's been stable for 3 years. We've scaled successfully before. The migration plan has been reviewed by 8 different people on this team, including me. We're not going to redesign our entire system architecture at the last minute based on worst-case scenario modeling." He could see the frustration building in her expression, the way her hands clenched slightly. In another context, he might have admired her persistence. But right now, with the CEO breathing down his neck about the European expansion, with stock analysts watching their quarterly numbers, with his own bonus tied to hitting this launch date, he needed certainty and consensus, not a junior engineer's catastrophic predictions. "The worst-case scenario is what we should be planning for," Maya said, her voice rising slightly. "That's literally the definition of responsible infrastructure engineering. You plan for failure, not for everything going perfectly." "And we have planned for failure," Tom interjected. "We have redundancy built in. We have automated failover systems. We have monitoring and alerting. We're not cowboys here, Maya." David glanced at his watch. They were already 20 minutes over on this meeting, and he had back-to-back calls scheduled for the rest of the afternoon. "All right," he said, closing his laptop with a decisive click. "Here's what we're going to do. Tom, I want you to add some additional monitoring around the database clusters. Set up alerts if we start approaching 75% capacity. Maya, I want you to document your concerns in a detailed email and send them to Tom and me. We'll review them, and if there are specific, implementable safeguards we can add without disrupting the timeline, we'll consider them. But the migration happens on November 1st. That's final." He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Around the table, people began gathering their laptops and coffee cups, the collective relief of a difficult meeting being over palpable in the room. Maya sat still for a moment, staring at her screen, then slowly closed her laptop. As people filed out, David caught Tom's eye and gave him a subtle nod. Tom understood. Keep an eye on Maya. Make sure she doesn't become a problem. Outside in the hallway, David heard fragments of conversation, someone laughing about weekend plans, someone complaining about the new parking garage rates, the normal ambient noise of a tech company in the middle of an ordinary Thursday morning. He pulled out his phone and fired off a quick Slack message to the CEO. "Migration on track. Team aligned. Novi 1 is locked in." 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared. Then the reply, "Good. Board meeting next week. Need this win." David pocketed his phone and headed back to his office, passing the open floor plan where engineers sat at their standing desks, headphones on, fingers flying across keyboards. The company occupied 4 floors of the building now, up from just half a floor when he joined as employee number 12. They'd grown so fast, too fast, maybe, but that was the nature of the industry. You scaled or you died. You moved fast or someone else beat you to market. His office overlooked the downtown skyline, Lady Bird Lake visible in the distance. On his desk sat a framed photo of his wife Jessica and their twin daughters, 7 years old, gap-toothed and grinning at the beach in California last summer. Next to it, an Innovator of the Year award from a tech publication, a stack of vendor proposals, a coffee mug that said, "There's no place like 127,001." He sat down and opened his email. 43 unread messages. He started working through them mechanically. Approvals, questions, updates. About an hour later, Maya's email arrived, the subject line reading, "Critical Infrastructure Concerns re EU Migration." He opened it. It was long, easily 2,000 words, with embedded charts, graphs, and terminal outputs. She'd clearly spent time on it. He skimmed the first few paragraphs, saw phrases like cascading failure scenario and database deadlock conditions and catastrophic data loss. He scrolled down, saw more technical specifications about connection pooling and replication topology. It was impressive in its way, thorough, but also exactly what he'd expected, a junior engineer's paranoid deep dive into everything that could theoretically go wrong. He'd been in the industry long enough to know the difference between people who saw problems everywhere and people who knew how to ship products. He forwarded the email to Tom with a brief note. "Please review and let me know if there's anything actually actionable here. Don't let this derail the timeline." Tom's response came back within minutes. "Will do. She's smart, but inexperienced. Doesn't understand the business context." David closed his email and turned to the window. The sun was lower now, orange light painting the buildings. Somewhere below, traffic was building on 6th Street as people started their evening commutes. Food trucks were probably setting up for dinner service. The city hummed with its usual energy. He had no way of knowing that in exactly 17 days this same view would look very different. That the calm he felt in this moment was the calm before a storm that would cost the company $17 million, destroy relationships he'd spent years building, and force him to confront truths about himself he'd been avoiding his entire career. The warning was sitting in his inbox, meticulously documented and mathematically precise. He'd just chosen not to believe it. That evening, David drove home, replaying the meeting in his mind. He told himself he'd made the right call. Tom was his most experienced infrastructure lead, 15 years in the industry, battle-tested through multiple scaling challenges. The rest of the senior team had signed off on the migration plan. They couldn't restructure their entire architecture based on one person's concerns, no matter how intelligent that person was. But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered, "What if she's right?" He pushed it away. At dinner, Sophie asked him about his day. "Did you solve any big problems, Daddy?" "We're working on a big project," David said, cutting into his chicken, "helping people in other countries use our software." "Like Europe?" Emma asked. They'd been studying geography in school. "Exactly like Europe," David confirmed. "Is it hard?" Sophie pressed. "It's complicated," David said, "but we have a good plan." Jessica caught his eye across the table, and he could see the question there, the one she'd stopped asking out loud because she already knew the answer. "Are you sure? Are you really sure?" Later, after the girls were asleep, Jessica found him in his home office, still staring at his laptop. "You're worried about something," she said. It wasn't a question. "There's a lot riding on this migration," David admitted. "Millions of dollars in contracts, our expansion strategy, my reputation." "What does your gut tell you?" Jessica asked. David thought about Maya's face in the meeting, the certainty in her voice, the data in her email. "My gut tells me I'm doing the right thing by trusting my senior team," he said, but that night he barely slept. The days before November 1st moved with the relentless momentum of a timeline that couldn't be changed. David spent most of his time in status meetings, reviewing checklists and reassuring executives that everything was on track. The European sales team had already started promoting the new service availability. Marketing had scheduled a press release. The CEO mentioned it in an interview with TechCrunch. Maya had stopped raising objections in meetings. She sat quietly during the daily stand-ups, giving brief updates on her assigned tasks, minor bug fixes, documentation updates, routine maintenance. Tom had mentioned to David that she seemed less combative, which David took as a good sign. He didn't have time for internal drama. The silence from Maya should have been reassuring. Instead, it gnawed at him. On October 20th, 4 days after the contentious meeting, David found himself in the break room at 2 in the afternoon, making his 4th coffee of the day. The machine gurgled and hissed, filling a paper cup with liquid that was more caffeine delivery system than actual beverage. He was alone in the small room with its view of the parking garage when Tom walked in. "Got a second?" Tom asked, though his tone suggested it wasn't really optional. "Sure," David said, stirring in creamer. Tom glanced at the doorway, then lowered his voice. "Maya's been running unauthorized load tests on the staging environment, using significant compute resources. I caught it in the billing reports." David felt his jaw tighten. "What kind of tests?" "Simulating post-migration traffic patterns," Tom said. "Building worst-case scenarios. She's basically trying to prove herself right." "Has it interfered with any production work?" David asked. "No," Tom admitted. "She's doing it during off hours, but it's insubordinate, right? We made a decision as a team. She needs to respect that." David thought about this. On one hand, Tom was right. The decision had been made, and constantly second-guessing it wasn't helpful. On the other hand, Maya was using her own time and company resources to prepare for potential failures. Was that insubordination, or was it diligence? "Let her run the tests," David said finally. "If she finds something we missed, better to know now than after launch." Tom looked skeptical but nodded. "Your call." After Tom left, David stood alone in the break room, holding his coffee and staring out at the concrete expanse of the parking garage. Rows of cars baking in the Texas sun. People coming and going, living their lives, unaware of the small dramas playing out 18 floors above them. He took out his phone and pulled up Maya's original email again. He'd read it 3 times now, each time finding details he'd missed before. The precision of her analysis was remarkable. She hadn't just identified potential problems. She'd quantified them, modeled them, and proposed specific solutions. But implementing those solutions would mean delaying the migration by at least 4 weeks. It would mean going back to the CEO and admitting they'd missed something critical in the planning phase. It would mean disappointing the European sales team, potentially losing deals to competitors who could deliver faster. The cost of being wrong about the migration was measured in money and reputation. The cost of being right about Maya's warnings was measured in time and pride. David put his phone away and went back to his office. That evening on his way out, he walked past Maya's desk. It was after 7 and most people had left. She was there as he'd somehow known she would be. 3 monitors glowing in the dim overhead lighting. He stood there for a moment, unseen, watching her work. She was completely absorbed, fingers flying across the keyboard, occasionally stopping to study a graph or scroll through what looked like database logs. There was something almost meditative about her focus. A kind of quiet intensity that reminded David of himself at that age, back when he was the junior engineer staying late, trying to prove he belonged. When had he stopped being that person? When had he become the senior leader, too busy to look at the data himself, too confident in his own judgment to question it? He thought about walking over, asking her what she'd found in her tests, but something held him back. Pride, maybe, or fear of what she might tell him. Instead, he left quietly, the question unasked. The next few days blurred together in a cascade of final preparations: security audits, performance testing, conference calls with the European teams to coordinate the launch timing. David attended a board meeting where he presented the migration plan with a confidence he didn't entirely feel, answering questions about risk mitigation and contingency planning with practiced assurance. "What's your biggest concern?" one of the board members asked. Margaret Chen, a former CTO herself, who had a reputation for seeing through corporate optimism. David paused. He could give her the safe answer, talk about the complexity of coordinating across time zones, mention the usual suspects like potential network latency or DNS propagation delays. Or he could be honest. "Capacity," he said finally. "We're scaling up significantly. There's always risk when you're dealing with that kind of growth in traffic. And you're confident your infrastructure can handle it?" Margaret pressed. David thought about Maya's email, about the simulations showing failure at 80% capacity, about the fact that he hadn't personally reviewed the load testing results, had relied on Tom's team to certify them. "Yes," he said, and hoped it was true. After the board meeting, the CEO pulled him aside. Richard Castellano was 52, silver-haired and expensively suited, with the kind of aggressive optimism that had built Datasphere from a 3-person startup to a publicly traded company with 400 employees. "Margaret's right to push on capacity," Richard said, "but I trust you. You've never let me down before." The weight of that trust felt heavier than it should have. "We're ready," David said. "Good. Because the analysts are watching this launch. We deliver successfully, we're looking at a potential stock bump and easier fundraising for the next phase. We stumble." Richard didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. On the evening of October 23rd, 8 days before the migration, David was working late when he noticed Maya was still at her desk. It was past 7, and most of the floor had emptied out. Through the glass walls of his office, he could see her sitting alone in the dim overhead lighting, 3 monitors glowing in front of her, her posture suggesting intense concentration. He walked out to the floor. "Burning the midnight oil?" he asked, approaching her desk. She looked up, startled. "Oh, yeah, just running some tests." Her monitors showed what looked like a clone of their production environment, with metrics dashboards displaying various system performance indicators. Even from where he stood, David could see several graphs trending sharply upward in red. "What kind of tests?" he asked, hearing the edge in his own voice. "Load testing," she said. "I set up a staging environment that mirrors our production infrastructure. I'm simulating the traffic load we'll see after the European migration." "Maya," David said, feeling his frustration rising. "We've been over this. The migration is happening. You need to accept that and move on." "I am accepting it," she said, turning to face him fully. "That's why I'm doing this. If it's going to happen regardless of my concerns, I want to at least have documentation of what the failure pattern will look like. So if something goes wrong, we'll know exactly where to look." There was something in her tone that wasn't defiance, exactly. It was more like resignation mixed with determination, like someone building a lifeboat on a ship they knew was going to sink. "You're that certain we're going to fail?" David asked. "I'm certain the math says we will," Maya replied. "The question isn't if, it's when. During peak traffic hours, probably between 8 and 11 a.m. Central European Time, which overlaps with our morning traffic in the US. We're going to hit critical mass. The primary database cluster will start experiencing replication lag. The application servers will start timing out on queries. The load balancer will route traffic to secondary clusters that are already overloaded. Connection pools will exhaust, and then everything will cascade." She said it all in the same calm, factual tone someone might use to describe the weather forecast. No emotion, just data. "And you don't think Tom's team has planned for this?" David asked. "Tom's team is competent," Maya said, "but they're optimizing for the scenario where everything goes right. I'm the only one looking at what happens when things go wrong." David pulled up a chair and sat down across from her. "Show me," he said. Maya's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise, but she turned her laptop toward him. "This is a simulation I've built, using our actual production database schemas and traffic patterns. I'm stress testing the system with the projected load from European customers added to our current US traffic." She walked him through the data. Graphs showing database query times increasing exponentially as connection pools filled up. Charts demonstrating how the load balancer's algorithm would create cascading failures as it tried to route traffic to already overloaded servers. Timelines showing the predicted progression from first warning signs to total system collapse. It was comprehensive, sophisticated, and terrifying. "How long have you been working on this?" David asked quietly. "Every night for the past week," Maya admitted. "I keep hoping I'll find a variable I missed, some assumption that's wrong, something that will prove my initial analysis was overly pessimistic. But every simulation confirms the same thing." David stared at the screen. "If you're right about this—" "I am right about this," Maya interrupted, not aggressively but with absolute certainty. "The math doesn't lie. The question is whether anyone's willing to listen." "The business needs this launch to happen," David said, hearing how weak it sounded even as he said it. "I know," Maya said, "and I'm not naive about the commercial pressures. But here's what I don't understand. Why is delaying a launch by a few weeks worse than having a catastrophic failure on day one? One delays revenue, the other destroys trust, costs millions in refunds, and damages the company's reputation for years. Which one is actually worse for the business?" It was a fair question, a devastatingly fair question. David found himself without a good answer. "The CEO won't go for a delay," he said finally. "He's already promised the board." "Then don't delay," Maya said. "Implement the horizontal sharding in parallel with the current infrastructure. It'll be more expensive. We'll be running redundant systems for a few weeks, but when the migration happens, we'll have the capacity to handle it. Then we gradually migrate traffic to the new architecture and deprecate the old one." "How much would that cost?" David asked. "Provisioning the additional infrastructure. Maybe 200,000 in cloud costs for a month," Maya said, "versus 17 million in SLA penalties and customer refunds when the system crashes." David sat back in his chair. $200,000. Not nothing, but not catastrophic either. He could probably get that approved if he framed it as extra redundancy during the migration, rather than "we need this because our initial plan was inadequate." "Write this up," he said. "Not the simulations predicting failure. That's going to make people defensive. Frame it as a belt and suspenders approach, extra redundancy during a critical migration period. Send it to me by tomorrow morning." Hope flickered across Maya's face. "Really?" "Really," David confirmed. "I can't promise it'll be approved, but I'll push for it." He stood up to leave, then paused. "Maya, why do you care this much? You could just document your concerns and cover yourself. If it fails, you'd be able to say, 'I told you so.' Why keep fighting?" Maya was quiet for a moment. "Because I actually care about building good systems," she said finally. "And because when this fails, if I'm right and I don't do everything I can to prevent it, people lose jobs, the company loses money, users lose trust. That matters more than being able to say I was right." David nodded slowly. "Get me that proposal," he said. Walking back to his office, David felt the first real stirrings of doubt, not about Maya's technical analysis, that was clearly sound, but about his own judgment, about whether he'd been making decisions based on data or based on ego, about whether the price of being wrong was one he was prepared to pay. He pulled out his phone and texted Jessica, "Going to be late. Important meeting tomorrow I need to prep for." Her response came quickly. "Emma's school play is tomorrow at 6. You promised." David closed his eyes. He had promised. 3 weeks ago, circled it on the family calendar, told Emma he wouldn't miss it for anything. "I'll be there," he texted back, "promise." But even as he typed it, he was thinking about the CEO meeting he'd need to schedule, the proposal he'd need to draft, the arguments he'd have to construct to justify the additional spending. The next morning, Maya's proposal arrived in his inbox at 6:47 a.m. It was excellent, concise, well-reasoned, framed in business terms rather than technical apocalypse scenarios. She'd outlined a phased approach that would provide redundancy without disrupting the migration timeline. David forwarded it to Tom with a note. "Thoughts? Seems like good insurance." Tom's response came during the morning stand-up, while David was half listening to status updates. "Expensive insurance for a problem that probably won't happen. If you want to spend $200K to make Maya feel better, that's your call, but I think it's overkill." David read the message twice. Tom was his most experienced infrastructure lead. If Tom thought the proposal was unnecessary, was David really going to overrule him based on a junior engineer's concerns? The old certainty crept back in. They had a good plan. They had capable people executing it. Maya was smart but inexperienced, seeing worst-case scenarios that seasoned engineers knew were unlikely to actually occur. He drafted a response to Maya. "Reviewed your proposal with Tom's team. Appreciate the thoroughness, but we're going to stick with the current plan. The redundancy you're proposing adds significant cost and complexity for edge case scenarios. We have monitoring and failover systems in place. Thank you for your diligence." His finger hovered over the send button. In the back of his mind, he heard Margaret Chen's voice from the board meeting. "What's your biggest concern?" He heard Maya's voice. "The math doesn't lie." He heard his own voice. "I trust you. You've never let me down before." David closed the email draft without sending it. He pulled up his calendar and found a gap at 2 p.m. He sent meeting invites to Tom, Maya, and 3 other senior engineers. Infrastructure redundancy discussion, 2 p.m. If they were going to reject Maya's proposal, at least he could force an actual discussion about it instead of dismissing it via email. The meeting was contentious. Tom argued that the additional infrastructure was unnecessary. 2 of the other senior engineers agreed with him. Maya presented her data methodically, answering technical questions, defending her assumptions. One of the senior engineers, Rachel Park, who'd been quiet through most of the discussion, finally spoke up. "I've been reviewing Maya's simulations during the meeting," she said. "Her methodology is sound. The scenarios she's modeling aren't edge cases. They're probable outcomes based on our current architecture. I think we should seriously consider this." Tom looked annoyed. "Rachel, you're a front-end engineer. With all due respect, this is infrastructure territory." "With all due respect," Rachel shot back, "I helped architect the front-end systems that are going to be making all these database calls. If Maya's right about connection pool exhaustion, it's going to manifest in my code failing. So yes, I have standing in this conversation." David watched the dynamics shift in the room. What had been a 4-1 dismissal of Maya's concerns was becoming a genuine technical debate. "All right," he said, cutting through the crosstalk. "Here's what we're going to do. Maya, I want you to present this analysis to the CEO tomorrow morning. Just you, me, him, and the CFO. If Richard is willing to approve the additional spending, we implement your redundancy plan. If not, we go forward with the current architecture. Fair?" Maya looked surprised, but nodded. Fair. That evening, David made it to Emma's school play with 10 minutes to spare. He slid into the seat next to Jessica in the elementary school auditorium, the air thick with the smell of industrial floor cleaner and excited children. "You made it," Jessica said, and he could hear the genuine surprise in her voice. "I promised," David replied. They watched Emma perform in a production of The Wizard of Oz. Her gap-toothed grin, visible even from the back row as she sang about being a munchkin in a land of sweets. Sophie sat on David's lap, pointing out her sister every time she appeared on stage. For 90 minutes, David wasn't the CTO of DataSphere dealing with infrastructure crises and migration timelines. He was just a dad watching his daughter perform in an elementary school play, and it felt like the first time in months he'd actually been present for something that mattered. After the play, they went out for ice cream, a family tradition for special occasions. The girls chatted about the performance, about who forgot their lines, about the kid who threw up backstage from nerves. "Daddy seemed different tonight," Emma observed, chocolate ice cream on her nose. "Different how?" David asked. "Like you were actually here," she said, with the brutal honesty only 7-year-olds can muster. Jessica caught his eye over the girls' heads, and he saw the question there. Is this real? Or is this just for tonight? He wanted to tell her he was changing, that he was going to be more present, that work wouldn't always come first, but he'd made those promises before and broken them. Instead, he just said, "I'm trying," and this time he meant it. The next morning, David, Maya, Richard, the CEO, and Angela, the CFO, gathered in the executive conference room. Maya presented her analysis with a calm professionalism that impressed David. She walked through the technical details, but translated them into business terms: risk, cost, probability, impact. "So you're saying," Angela summarized when Maya finished, "that for a $200,000 investment, we can essentially eliminate the risk of a catastrophic failure during our most important launch of the year." "Yes," Maya said simply. Richard leaned back in his chair. "And if we don't make this investment, your analysis predicts what exactly?" "System failure within the first few hours of the European launch," Maya said. "Probably between 8 and 11 a.m. Central European Time on November 1st. Complete service disruption lasting between 2 and 6 hours, depending on how quickly we can implement emergency fixes. Estimated cost, $15 to $20 million in SLA penalties, refunds, and customer churn. That's a very specific prediction, Richard said. The math is very specific, Maya replied. Richard looked at David. What do you think? This was the moment. David could side with Tom and the conventional wisdom that Maya was being overly cautious. Or he could trust the data, even if it meant admitting they'd missed something critical in the original planning. I think, David said carefully, that Maya's analysis is thorough and her recommendations are sound. I think spending $200,000 to mitigate a multi-million-dollar risk is prudent, and I think we should do it. Richard studied him for a moment, then turned to Angela. Can we fund this without impacting other priorities? Yes, Angela said. It's within my discretionary budget approval. Then do it, Richard said. David, work with Maya to implement this. I want daily updates on progress. And Maya, he looked directly at her, thank you for pushing on this. That took guts. As they filed out of the conference room, David felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that they were taking the right step. Embarrassment that it had taken a junior engineer pushing this hard to get here. Anxiety about the tight timeline to implement the changes. But mostly, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Confidence that they were actually prepared for what was coming. If only he'd trusted that feeling earlier. If only he'd listened the first time. The drive home took him south through Austin's evening traffic, past the downtown high-rises and into the suburban neighborhoods of South Congress. He and Jessica had bought the house 3 years ago, a 4-bedroom craftsman with a yard big enough for the girls to play in. It was a 40-minute commute each way, but worth it for the schools and the neighborhood. Jessica was in the kitchen when he arrived, unpacking groceries while the girls did homework at the dining room table. She looked up when he came in, and immediately he could tell she was frustrated. You said you'd be home by 6:30, she said, not quite accusingly, but close. I needed you to take Emma to soccer practice. I'm sorry, David said automatically. Meeting ran late. Is she? My mum took her, Jessica said. Again. David set his laptop bag down on the counter. His mother-in-law lived 10 minutes away and helped out frequently, but Jessica had been making pointed comments lately about how often they had to ask, about how much of the parenting burden fell on her. It's just a busy period, David said. The European migration is next week, and after that things will calm down. You said that about the last project, Jessica pointed out, and the one before that. She wasn't wrong. The tech industry ran on perpetual crisis mode, every quarter bringing some new urgent initiative that required long hours and weekend work. He'd been promising after this project for years now. This one's different, he said. This one's huge. If we pull it off, it's a major growth milestone. It could mean... I know what it could mean. Jessica interrupted gently. Stock options, bonuses, promotions. I get it, David, but the girls are 7 years old. They're not going to be 7 forever. And you're missing it. The words hit harder than he expected. He looked over at the dining room table where Sophie and Emma were bent over their math worksheets, blonde heads almost touching as they worked together on a problem. When had they gotten so big? It felt like yesterday they were toddlers learning to walk. You're right, he said quietly. I'm sorry. Jessica's expression softened slightly. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. I know you're working hard. I miss you. The girls miss you. That night, after the girls were in bed, David sat in his home office, reviewing vendor proposals and answering emails. But his mind kept drifting back to Maya's simulation models, to Jessica's comment about missing the girls' childhood, to the general feeling that he was juggling too many things, and some of them were starting to slip. The next morning, during the daily stand-up, Tom gave an update on the migration preparation. "We're 98% ready," he announced. "All the customer data is staged and validated. The cutover process is documented and tested. Monitoring is in place. Barring any surprises, we're on track for a smooth launch." David glanced at Maya. She was looking at her laptop, her face carefully neutral. "Any concerns from anyone?" David asked the room, a standard question he asked at every stand-up. Silence. "Great," David said. "Let's keep the momentum going." The week continued in a blur of preparation. Final security reviews, conference calls with the European sales team, a presentation to the board of directors where David walked through the migration plan with confidence, receiving approving nods and congratulations on the achievement. On the evening of October 31st, Halloween, David stayed late at the office while Jessica took the girls trick-or-treating. He'd promised to be home in time, but there was one last pre-launch review meeting that couldn't be rescheduled. He texted her a photo of himself at his desk with the apologetic message, "So sorry, we'll make it up to them this weekend." Her response was just a thumbs-up emoji, which somehow felt worse than an angry message would have. By the time David got home, it was after 10. The girls were asleep, their Halloween candy sorted into piles on the kitchen counter. Jessica was on the couch watching TV, still wearing her cat ears from whatever costume she'd worn while chaperoning. "How'd it go?" David asked quietly. "They had fun," Jessica said, not looking away from the screen. "Sophie kept asking where you were." "I'll take them to get ice cream this weekend," David offered, "wherever they want to go." "Sure," Jessica said, and the flatness in her voice made it clear she didn't believe him. David went upstairs and looked in on the girls. They were asleep in their shared room. Emma sprawled across her bed, still wearing her princess costume. Sophie curled up with a stuffed unicorn. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, feeling the weight of all the moments he was missing accumulating into something he couldn't quite measure but knew was significant. Tomorrow was the migration. Tomorrow all of this would be worth it. He had no idea how wrong he was. November 1st began with the kind of false calm that precedes disasters. David arrived at the office at 6 a.m., earlier than usual, to be present for the migration. The plan was to begin the cutover at 4 a.m. Central Time, when US traffic was at its lowest point, and complete it before European business hours began. But Maya's redundancy proposal had added a wrinkle to the timeline. Over the past week, her team had been frantically provisioning the additional infrastructure, configuring the horizontal sharding, and setting up the monitoring systems. The work was technically complex and time-sensitive, and they'd barely finished it the night before. By the time David arrived, Tom's infrastructure team had already been at it for 2 hours. The 18th floor was unusually crowded for so early in the morning. Probably 25 people clustered around monitors, laptops open on every available surface, the air thick with the smell of fresh coffee and nervous energy. Tom looked up when David entered, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he'd barely slept. "Right on schedule," he said, though his voice carried an edge of exhaustion. "Data migration completed at 5:47 a.m. We're running validation checks now. Everything looks clean." David felt a surge of relief. "European customers able to access the platform?" "We've got our test accounts logging in successfully from London, Berlin, Amsterdam and Paris," one of the engineers reported. "Response times are good. No errors. The redundant infrastructure Maya set up is distributing load properly." Maya herself was at a desk near the windows, 3 monitors showing real-time system metrics. She looked as exhausted as Tom, but there was something else in her expression, a tense vigilance, like someone watching storm clouds and waiting for the first crack of thunder. "Anything concerning on your end?" David asked, walking over to her station. "Not yet," Maya said, her eyes never leaving the screens, "but we won't know how the system really handles it until European users start their workday. That's when the true load test begins." David checked his watch. 6:23 a.m. Central, which meant it was 1:23 p.m. in Paris, 12:23 p.m. in London. European users were returning from lunch, starting their afternoon work sessions. The real traffic was about to hit. "Outstanding," David said, with more confidence than he felt. He fired off a quick message to the CEO. "Migration successful. EU customers online. Monitoring closely." The response was immediate. "Excellent work. Knew you'd deliver. Keep me posted." Over the next few hours, more people arrived for the normal workday. There was a cautiously celebratory atmosphere in the office. People congratulating Tom's team, quiet conversations about the successful cutover, someone bringing in breakfast tacos from a food truck on 6th Street. But David noticed that Maya hadn't moved from her monitoring station. She sat hunched over her keyboard, occasionally typing commands, her coffee growing cold beside her untouched. At 8:15 a.m., David was in his office responding to congratulatory emails when Maya appeared in his doorway. Her face was pale. "We have a problem," she said quietly. David's stomach dropped. "What kind of problem?" "European traffic is ramping up faster than the models predicted," Maya said, pulling up graphs on her laptop. "We're already at 68% capacity on the primary cluster. By my calculations, we'll hit critical threshold in about 90 minutes. But the redundant infrastructure," David started. "Is helping," Maya interrupted. "Without it, we'd already be failing. But the load is exceeding even the conservative estimates. I think we underestimated how many European users would immediately start heavy usage on day one." David felt cold dread spreading through his chest. "What do we need to do?" "I'm bringing additional capacity online now," Maya said. "But provisioning and configuring new nodes takes time. We're in a race between the increasing load and our ability to scale. It's going to be close." For the next hour, David watched the metrics climb with a sick fascination. The graphs on Maya's monitors crept steadily upward, 70%, 75%, 80%. Maya and her team worked frantically, spinning up new database nodes, adjusting load balancer configurations, optimizing query patterns. At 9:47 a.m., Tom knocked on David's office window, his expression grim. "We're seeing elevated error rates on the API endpoints," he said, pulling out his phone to show David a graph. "Started about 5 minutes ago. Database queries are taking longer to execute. We're seeing replication lag building up on the secondary clusters." "I thought Maya's infrastructure was handling this," David said, hearing the edge in his own voice. "It is handling it," Tom replied. "But the load is higher than anyone predicted. We're basically running at capacity across all clusters now, if traffic increases any further." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. David strode out to the main floor. The atmosphere had changed completely. The celebratory mood was gone, replaced by tense silence, broken only by urgent keyboard clicking and murmured technical conversations. Maya was standing at her desk, surrounded by 5 other engineers, all staring at monitors showing various system dashboards. "Status," David said, approaching the group. "We just crossed 85% capacity on the primary cluster," one of the engineers reported. "Connection pool is 92% utilized. Query latency is averaging 2-3 seconds, up from 200 milliseconds this morning. The customer support is getting reports of slow response times," another engineer added, looking at her laptop. "Nothing catastrophic yet, but users are noticing." Maya was typing commands rapidly, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "I'm provisioning 4 more database nodes, ETA 15 minutes to online. But we need to reduce load now, or we're going to hit critical mass before they're ready." "What about throttling?" Tom suggested. "Can we implement rate limiting on the European endpoints?" "That would impact user experience," David said automatically. "So will a complete system failure," Tom shot back. At 10:31 a.m., the first real alarm triggered. A klaxon sound erupted from someone's laptop, immediately silenced, but leaving a ringing in everyone's ears. The engineer who'd silenced it looked up, her face white. "Primary database cluster just hit 94% capacity," she said. "We're in critical zone." "Where are those new nodes?" David demanded. 7 minutes out, Maya said, her voice tight. "We're not going to make it." And then at 10:47 a.m., everything started to collapse. It began subtly. A few error messages in the application logs, a slight uptick in failed API requests. But within 60 seconds, the cascade had begun. The primary database cluster, overwhelmed by connection requests, started refusing new connections. The load balancer, following its programming, immediately routed those requests to the secondary clusters. But the secondary clusters were already running at 90% capacity, and the sudden influx of redirected traffic pushed them over the edge. Connection pools exhausted. Query timeouts multiplied. Application servers, unable to get database responses, started returning errors to users. And then the application servers themselves began failing, overwhelmed by the backlog of hanging requests. "We're down," someone said unnecessarily. The monitors told the story in brutal clarity. Error rates spiking to 80%, 90%, 98%. Response times measured in tens of seconds. Thousands of users suddenly unable to access the platform. David calls an emergency war room as systems fail across US and European regions. The dashboards show cascading database failures caused by overloaded clusters after the migration. Rolling back would erase tens of thousands of customer records, and scaling up will take too long to prevent SLA violations and mounting penalties. Maya confirms this is the exact failure she predicted weeks earlier. When David asks what can be done, she proposes a temporary code fix to aggressively manage database connections, an imperfect but fast solution to stop the system from collapsing long enough to rebalance the infrastructure. David immediately authorizes her plan and assigns senior engineers to help. As the crisis worsens, he speaks with the CEO, who is furious over the outage's impact on new European enterprise customers. With reputation, revenue, and trust on the line, David is told to fix the problem at any cost. The disaster is now undeniable, and Maya's warnings have become the only path forward. David stood in the hallway for a moment, staring at his phone. Through the glass walls, he could see the war room full of engineers staring at monitors. He could see Maya at her desk, typing at incredible speed, her team clustered around her. He could see customer support on their phones, dealing with angry clients. He thought about the meeting 3 weeks ago when Maya had first raised her concerns. He thought about how easily he'd dismissed her. He thought about the email she'd sent with meticulous documentation of exactly this scenario. He thought about all the small decisions, the interruptions, the tone, the assumptions that had led to this moment. For the next hour, David watched Maya work. She was in what athletes call the zone, completely focused, moving between code and terminal commands with fluid precision. She'd occasionally call out instructions to Rachel or one of the other engineers, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. At 11:52 a.m., she deployed the first version of the connection pooling fix. The room went silent, everyone watching the dashboards. For about 30 seconds, nothing changed. Error rates remained catastrophically high. Response times stayed in double digits. Then, slowly, the graphs started to shift. Error rates ticked down from 98% to 93%, to 87% to 74%. Response times began dropping from 15 seconds to 12 to 9 to 6. "It's working," someone said, almost reverently. "That's bought us some breathing room," Maya said, her voice hoarse from an hour of shouting technical instructions. "But the underlying capacity problem hasn't changed. We need those new database nodes fully integrated and rebalanced as soon as possible." Tom's team had been working frantically on the infrastructure provisioning. "We've got the 4 new nodes online," one of them reported. "Starting the data rebalancing process now. Current ETA to completion, 2 hours, give or take." 2 hours. David pulled up his watch. It was 11:57 a.m. They'd been in crisis for over an hour. Customer support had logged over 3,000 tickets. The financial impact was growing by the minute. "Can we expedite that?" David asked. "Not without risking data integrity," Tom said. "We're already cutting corners. Normally, this would be a 6-hour process done during maintenance windows. We're doing it live under load, which is incredibly risky. If we push any faster, we could actually make things worse." David nodded. There was nothing to do but wait and watch. He pulled up customer support metrics on his phone. The damage was mounting. Enterprise clients were threatening to invoke SLA penalty clauses. Social media was filling with angry posts about the outage. A competitor had already posted a snarky tweet: "When reliability matters, choose a platform that actually works." Datasphere down. At 12:30 p.m., with error rates down to 40% but still far from acceptable, David received a call from Margaret Chen, the board member who'd questioned him about capacity risks. "I'm not calling to yell," she said, though her tone suggested she wanted to. "I'm calling because I'm trying to understand what happened. Walk me through the timeline." David did, starting with the initial meeting 3 weeks ago through Maya's warnings, the decision to implement redundancy, and the unexpected surge in European traffic that had overwhelmed even the expanded infrastructure. Margaret was quiet for a moment after he finished. "So you're telling me," she said slowly, "that a junior engineer predicted this exact failure 3 weeks ago. You initially ignored her, then implemented partial mitigations, but the load still exceeded projections?" "Yes," David said. "And if you'd implemented her full recommendations 3 weeks ago?" Margaret asked. David thought about Maya's original proposal, the horizontal sharding across additional clusters, the enhanced load-balancing algorithms, the more conservative capacity planning. "We probably would have been fine," he admitted. "Probably," Margaret repeated. "That's a very expensive probably, David." After the call ended, David returned to the war room. The afternoon crawled by in a haze of incremental improvements. By 1:15 p.m., error rates were down to 20%. By 2:30 p.m., the data rebalancing was 70% complete and system performance was approaching acceptable levels. By 4:15 p.m., users could reliably access the platform again, though some features were still degraded. Maya was still at her desk when David walked over at 4:47 p.m. She looked utterly drained, her eyes bloodshot, her hands shaking slightly from too much caffeine and adrenaline. "Thank you," David said, "for the fix. You saved us." She looked up at him with an expression that was impossible to read. Exhaustion, certainly, but also something else. Disappointment, maybe, or just bone-deep fatigue. Maya confronts David, telling him she warned him weeks earlier and was ignored, not because she was wrong, but because she was young and lacked perceived credibility. The hardest part for her wasn't the failure itself, but being powerless to stop it while watching others celebrate a launch she knew would collapse. Exhausted and hurt, she leaves. That evening, David realizes he's also failed at home. He chooses to leave work and goes home earlier than usual, surprising his daughters. Sitting with them, he admits he made serious mistakes by not listening. Jessica watches, uncertain whether this moment signals real change. The next morning, David faces the executive team. The financial and reputational damage is severe, $17 million and counting. When questioned, David takes full responsibility. He admits they were warned in advance by Maya, a junior engineer who accurately predicted the failure and proposed a solution. He explains that he dismissed her because of hierarchy, deadlines, and fear of delaying the launch, and because he didn't believe a 26-year-old could be right over senior leaders. He presents Maya's original analysis, which clearly shows the failure and how it could have been prevented. The room falls silent as leadership sees the truth. The disaster wasn't caused by missing data, but by refusing to listen. The General Counsel leaned forward, reading closely. "This is remarkably detailed," she said. She even predicted the time frame, said failure would occur during peak European hours overlapping with US morning traffic. That's exactly when it happened. "This is better analysis than I've seen from most senior engineers," the VP of Engineering said. Scrolling through the technical details, "The methodology is sound. The data modeling is sophisticated. If we'd implemented even half of these recommendations, we wouldn't be having this conversation," Richard finished. He leaned back in his chair, studying David with an expression that was impossible to read. "You know what bothers me most about this. It's not that we failed. Failures happen in tech. It's that we failed predictably. This wasn't some black swan event. This was a junior engineer with a laptop and some basic simulation tools, accurately predicting exactly what would happen. And we ignored her because of organizational hierarchy and timeline pressure." The VP of Sales spoke up. "With all respect, hindsight is 20/20. Capacity planning is complex. Even experts get it wrong sometimes." "She's not claiming to be an expert," Richard shot back. "She's claiming to be someone who did the math, and the math was right. We just didn't want to believe it." The meeting continued for another 3 hours. They worked through customer communication strategies, legal exposure assessments, remediation timelines. The General Counsel outlined the SLA penalty framework. They'd need to issue service credits within 30 days or face potential litigation. The VP of Sales reported that 3 major enterprise clients had already reached out to discuss early contract terminations. When they finally broke for lunch, Richard asked David to stay behind. The room emptied until it was just the two of them, and the projected image of Maya's email still glowing on the screen. "Talk to me candidly," Richard said. "Not as your CEO, but as someone who's made plenty of my own mistakes. What happened here?" David was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts. "I think I got comfortable," he said finally. "I've been CTO for 4 years. We've executed major projects successfully. I started to believe that my judgment was always right, that my experience trumped data, that disagreement from junior team members was a sign they didn't understand the full context rather than a sign I was missing something." "Pride," Richard said. "It wasn't a question." "Yeah," David admitted. "Pride. And fear, too. Fear of having to go back to the board and delay a major initiative. Fear of looking indecisive or weak by changing course based on one person's concerns. Fear that if I listened to Maya, it would undermine my senior team's confidence in me." Richard nodded slowly. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "First, we're implementing every single recommendation in Maya's original analysis. I don't care if it takes 2 months and costs $500,000 in infrastructure. We're doing it right this time. Second, we're conducting a comprehensive post-mortem, not just on the technical failure, but on our decision-making processes. I want to understand how we created an environment where accurate warnings could be dismissed. And David," he looked directly at him, "you're going to be leading that review, and it's going to be uncomfortable." "I understand," David said. "I'm not sure you do," Richard replied. "This is going to mean examining your leadership style, your biases, your blind spots. It's going to mean hearing feedback from people who were afraid to give it to you before. It's going to mean potentially changing how you operate as a leader, which is hard for anyone, but especially hard for someone who's been successful. Are you willing to do that?" David thought about Maya's face when she'd said, "You didn't want to hear it." He thought about Jessica's comment about missing the girl's childhood. He thought about the pattern of choices that had led him to this point. "Yes," he said, "I'm willing." That afternoon, David worked through a mountain of emails, customer complaints, investor questions, internal damage assessments. Each one was a small reminder of the cost of his mistake. A London-based financial services firm terminating their contract, a Berlin startup demanding service credits, a Dutch enterprise client CCing their legal team on their concerns. Around 4 p.m., he forced himself to stop and actually go home. Jessica was in the backyard with the girls, raking leaves in the mild November afternoon. Through the kitchen window, he watched them for a moment. Sophie jumping in leaf piles, Emma trying to help with the raking, Jessica laughing at something one of them said. When he stepped outside, all three of them looked up in surprise. "You're home," Jessica said, checking her phone to confirm the time. "It's 4:30 on a Saturday." "I know," David said. "I wanted to help with the leaves." David spends a simple afternoon doing yard work with his family and realizes how much he's been missing. That evening, he opens up to Jessica about a disastrous outage at work and the warnings he ignored. She gently but firmly points out that the same pattern, dismissing concerns and postponing change, has been hurting their family too. David admits she's right, but she challenges him to prove real change through actions, not promises. The following week is consumed by damage control. David personally apologizes to customers, faces financial and legal fallout, and calls a company-wide meeting. He openly takes responsibility, explains that the outage wasn't just technical but cultural, and publicly acknowledges that Maya had predicted the failure. He announces concrete changes to empower dissenting voices and reform decision-making processes. Later, David apologizes to Maya directly and puts her in charge of the infrastructure overhaul, giving her full authority and resources. She leads the project with skill and collaboration, earning respect across teams. Recognizing deeper issues, David begins working with an executive coach. Through difficult conversations, he realizes fear of being wrong, of losing status, of disappointing others, had driven his worst decisions. The coaching forces him to confront his biases, defensiveness, and leadership habits. The process is uncomfortable, humbling, and exhausting, but necessary for real change. At home, David made changes too. He blocked off time on his calendar specifically for family, dinner every weeknight at 6:30, weekends reserved, except for genuine emergencies, bedtime routines with the girls every night he was in town. Jessica watched these changes with cautious optimism. "It's been 3 weeks," she said one evening after the girls were asleep. "That's longer than you've stuck with past promises." "I'm not doing it because I promised," David said. "I'm doing it because I finally understand what I was missing. All those evenings I stayed late at the office, I told myself I was providing for you and the girls. But what I was really doing was avoiding the hard work of being present. It's easier to solve a technical problem than to help Sophie with her anxiety about school. It's easier to review code than to actually listen when Emma talks about her day. I was using work as an excuse to avoid the messy, difficult, important parts of being a husband and father." Jessica was quiet for a moment. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in months," she finally said. The board of directors conducted their own review of the incident. While they didn't fire David, they made it clear his future at the company depended on demonstrating improved judgment and leadership. His bonus for the year was eliminated entirely. The promotion to senior vice president that he'd been expecting was quietly taken off the table. His stock option grant was reduced. The financial hit was significant, but David found he cared less about it than he would have expected. The money was just money. What bothered him more was the loss of trust, with his team, with customers, with the board. Trust took years to build and could be destroyed in hours. 3 months after the incident, as winter settled into Austin and the company began planning for the new year, David convened a final post-mortem review session. The findings were compiled into a comprehensive document that would be shared with every employee. The report was unflinching in its assessment. The outage was preventable. The warnings were clear and data-backed. The decision to ignore them was driven by organizational hierarchy, timeline pressure, and leadership blind spots. The cost was measured not just in money, but in damaged relationships, lost opportunities, and a cultural pattern that needed to change. But the report also documented the changes implemented: new escalation procedures, reformed decision-making processes, mandatory bias training, a technical review board with diverse perspectives. And it included interviews with team members about what they'd learned. Maya's quote was particularly memorable. "We learned that good engineering isn't just about writing elegant code or designing efficient systems. It's about creating a culture where truth can be spoken to power, where data matters more than hierarchy, where being right is more important than being senior. That's harder to build than any technical system, but it's ultimately more valuable." 6 months after the incident, the infrastructure Maya had designed was stable and scaling smoothly. The company had recovered most of the lost customers. The transparent post-mortem and genuine remediation efforts had actually built credibility with some clients. A major competitor experienced their own massive outage around the same time, making DataSphere's response look good by comparison. Maya had been promoted to senior engineer, becoming the youngest person at the company to hold that title. Her opinions carried weight in technical discussions, not because of her title, but because she'd proven she could see problems others missed and propose solutions that actually worked. David was still CTO, but a different one than he'd been before the incident. In meetings, he found himself asking, "What am I missing?" and actually listening to the answers. When junior engineers raised concerns, he took them seriously regardless of their tenure. When he felt certain about a decision, he specifically sought out people who disagreed with him to stress test his thinking. The changes were sometimes uncomfortable. His decisiveness, one of the traits that had made him successful early in his career, had to be tempered with more deliberation. His confidence had to make room for genuine uncertainty. His leadership had to evolve from, "I know the answer," to, "Let's figure this out together." One afternoon in April, 7 months after the outage, David was reviewing a proposal for a new product launch. It was ambitious, a significant expansion into a new market segment with aggressive timelines and substantial technical complexity. The business case was compelling. The executive team was enthusiastic. David called a technical review session. Among the attendees was Maya, now a key voice in architecture decisions. "I've been analyzing the capacity requirements for this launch," Maya said, pulling up a presentation, "and I have some concerns about the timeline. The infrastructure scaling we'd need to support the projected user growth is significant. We can do it, but not in the time frame being proposed without taking on substantial risk." David felt the familiar pull, the business pressure to move fast, the executive enthusiasm that would be disappointed by delays, the temptation to believe they could make it work through sheer effort and optimism. But he'd learned this lesson, the expensive way. "Walk me through your analysis," he said, pulling out his notepad. David carefully listens to Maya's concerns and asks her to present them to the executive team, showing how much he's changed since a costly failure a year earlier. He now prioritizes listening, humility, and evidence over ego and speed. At home, David is more present with his family, no longer letting work intrude into evenings. He reflects on how failure reshaped his values, teaching him that success comes from learning, not being right. Maya later sends additional risk analysis for the Q3 launch. Instead of feeling threatened, David is grateful and shares it with leadership. The company agrees to slow down and do things right, showing that the cultural shift is real. 18 months after the outage, the product launches successfully with a revised timeline. Leadership publicly acknowledges the importance of listening to engineers and learning from past mistakes. Maya receives an external job offer, but chooses to stay after. David assures her that the cultural changes are permanent and institutional. Her decision confirms that trust has been rebuilt. David ends the day at home with his family, reflecting on the high cost of past mistakes and the lasting value of humility, listening, and growth. He commits to asking better questions and never ignoring dissenting voices again, knowing that learning to listen made all the difference.